Humanities Forum. My name is Raymond Hain, and I'm the director of the forum and a member of the philosophy department here at PC. The Humanities Forum exists to be a space for the whole campus to come together regularly to think about topics of deep importance within the humanities, but also connected to the rest of the disciplines that we have here at PC. It's particularly exciting today that we have a topic that brings together work in the sciences with work in the humanities. And to get us going today, let me please ask you to welcome Chris Liddy from the management department here at PC, who will introduce our guest.
Hello, how's everyone doing today? Great, wonderful. Well, as Raymond said, I'm Chris Liddy. I'm an assistant professor of management here at PC. And it's my great honor and privilege today to introduce Dr. Judson Brewer of UMass Medical, where he's an associate professor of psychiatry and medicine. And in addition to that prestigious role, he also holds a number of other roles in terms of serving as chief of the division of mindfulness. That's right, mindfulness. You can have a division of mindfulness at a major medical school at this point, as well as the director of research at the world-renowned Center for Mindfulness there. If you're familiar with Jon Kabat-Zinn, this is the center that he started about 35 years ago, and has been instrumental in sharing the notion of mindfulness with the world since. So I could go on and about Dr. Brewer's many accomplishments, but I think what stands out for me is how he's been able to intersect both great science and great useful practice. It's very hard to combine both. In terms of practice, he and his colleagues have been able to study how the quality and practice of mindfulness impacts major aspects of human experience, including attention and the self, and further actually been able to connect these aspects of our experience to specific components of the brain, which I think is just phenomenal to be discovering, especially so early in his career. And oftentimes with great science, it's very hard to find practical utility to these kinds of ideas, but Dr. Brewer has been a leader in this area as well. He and his colleagues are developing and validating mindfulness-based therapies for transforming bad habits and dealing with negative emotions like smoking, eating, other types of addictions, anxiety. Beyond that, I feel like many times great scientists are not great communicators to the mainstream public. They get so caught up and involved in their own ideas that they can't share that with others. But in this area, Dr. Brewer is also excelling. Some of you may have seen his 60 Minutes conversation with Anderson Cooper on the subject. He's also been featured in any number of major news outlets like Forbes and the BBC and NPR. And finally, while many of these accomplishments are very public, I just want to say personally it's been an honor to know Dr. Brewer, or Judd as he's more colloquially known. So my research is around mindfulness at work and trying to extend and share the benefits of mindfulness to workplace and management audiences. And while this is far outside of Judd's area, he's nonetheless been incredibly generous and supportive with his time. He's come and presented at our Academy of Management conference to help lend credence to some of these ideas and share knowledge about neuroscience and mindfulness with those audiences. Further, he even was willing to co-author a paper, review paper that I and several other colleagues worked on, where we shared these insights for a management audience. And as if all that wasn't enough, I think when I think to Providence College's values around faith and reason and contemplation, I know his work is very much at the intersection of all these ideas. So I think I couldn't be more excited to introduce him to you today, and please extend a very warm welcome to Dr. Judson Brewer.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Raymond, for inviting me. It's a real an honor to be here. What I thought we could do is really, maybe we could even start with a little bit of a mental riddle and kind of chew on that a little bit as we go through this talk and see if perhaps even we could answer this together at the end. I don't know if any of you have heard this story. This is actually an old Zen story. And this is a picture of a guy named Dazu Hoika. And the story goes that many years after the last Indian ancestor of Buddhism, whose name was Bodhidharma, had arrived in China, this guy Dazu Hoika went to study with this enigmatic teacher. And Bodhidharma had been sitting in a cave, staring at the wall for about 10 years, and Hoika tried many things to get this master's attention, and tried many, many things, could never get his attention, and eventually, out of desperation, he cut off his arm and presented it to Bodhidharma. As you can see, they didn't show the blood and guts part of the picture, but no arm. Upon seeing this, Bodhidharma said, "What do you want?" Hoika said, "My mind is not at ease. Please pacify my mind." Bodhidharma said, "Bring me your mind and I will pacify it." Hoika replied, "When I look for my mind, I cannot find it. There, I have pacified it for you." So just let that sit in your brain as we go through this talk, and we'll see how we can link this story up with habit formation, and even, which I hope is not, you can certainly, this is the great place to bring something like this out and be provocative. We can even link this to selflessness and spirituality. And I have to say, this has been a conversation that I have really enjoyed having with one of your illustrious professors here, Dr. Leonard Fleckman, for about 10 years. For any of you that are in her class here for extra credit, you can thank her for helping to kick off this conversation. So let's start with Meister Eckhart. Maybe some of you are familiar with him. God is not found in the soul by any kind of addition, but by a process of subtraction. So what's he talking about? Or as Alice in Wonderland said, who in the world am I? That's the great puzzle. So maybe I can start just with a clinical vignette. I work in an addiction clinic at UMass, and I treat a number of different types of folks, and in particular have been working with folks with binge eating disorder, because there's a type of an addictive quality to that. And I had a patient come to me. She was about 30 years of age. She was of a very unhealthy weight. And as we started going through her history, she was describing a couple of really interesting things. So one, she was the daughter of parents who had survived the Khmer Rouge genocide and had immigrated to the U.S. as refugees, and had gone through all sorts of unspeakable psychological trauma. And her mother, my patient was about 8, her mother started actually taking out some of this stuff on her emotionally, and so was starting to emotionally abuse her. And as any 8-year-old would do, this is not right. What can I do to help protect myself? And what she started learning was that she could eat food to help numb herself from this onslaught and these emotions that she was having. By the time she came to see me, she was 30 years of age. She met all the diagnostic criteria for binge eating disorder. Just to give you an example, she was eating entire large pizzas in one sitting at least 20 out of 30 days a month. And the way she described it was that she was literally eating to numb herself. But you can imagine where that came from. And so we can even think about this type of thing in terms of how do these behaviors, and I would even say, how do these habits get formed? So as a way to start unpacking that question, I think we can start by just looking to see, how far we as humans have come over the years. And so I'm going to show you a short video. This is a woman looking at her cell phone. Right? So and in New Haven, Connecticut, at one point they had to paint on the sidewalks, look up. I don't think the Yale students were getting any dumber, but it's certainly clear that these phones were getting a lot smarter. So what's going on here? So maybe we could even, we'll roll up our sleeves and dive into this. I'll kind of tell a little bit of a story from a time when my wife and I were at a conference in Paris, and she actually said, "Oh, take this picture. This is a great sociologic experiment." So what she was talking about at the time was, this is 2014, and many of you might be familiar with this device in the center of the picture, the selfie stick. In 2014, Time magazine named it one of their top 25 inventions of the year. To me, it's a sign of the apocalypse, but I think this is a beautiful portrayal, because guess who this guy is? This is the boyfriend now rendered obsolete, right? So if we think of our, we're at the Louvre, we're with our boyfriend and our best friend, and we're having a great time, our brain says, this is amazing. Let's keep this good feeling going. And it says, let's take a picture. We say, great idea, let's take a picture. And then it says, no, I have a better idea. Let's post this on Facebook. And so how do we spend the rest of our day at the Louvre? Do we look at the priceless artwork? Do we look at Hammurabi's code? Or do we check Facebook to see how many likes we got? So just think of that as we go through this talk. But I can't go forward without mentioning that the French, they do everything with style. Vive la France. So what's going on here? There was a study that was done at Harvard University a couple of years ago where they put people in an fMRI scanner. And the way that we do brain imaging studies is we have two conditions. We compare one condition to another. And what they did was in one condition, they offered people money. And in another condition, they let them basically talk about themselves. So guess what people chose to do? And as they were talking about themselves, they were activating a part of their brain called the nucleus accumbens, which is this downstream pathway of these dopaminergic neurons from the ventral tegmental area. That's all fancy terminology for this is a really ingrained reward-based learning pathway. This pathway is actually activated when we use cocaine, use opioids, drink alcohol, smoke cigarettes, and apparently when we use Facebook. So there's something actually rewarding about this. And there was another study that showed that you could actually predict the amount of time people spent on Facebook based on how much their nucleus accumbens was activated. Just a couple of years ago, there was a study with Instagram where they put adolescents in the scanner, and the only manipulation they made was how many likes they got. And they looked at their brain activity. Again, they found that the nucleus accumbens was activated, but they were also activating a brain region that was involved in self-referential processing. And we're going to come back to this in a moment, but I just want to make this connection to start. So this is linking up reward with self, okay? Here's the summary slide of the talk so far, okay? Now, how ingrained is this? There's actually a lot of research now. Some researchers call this Facebook addiction disorder. And you can imagine these women at the Louvre, they're having a great time. Their brain starts to learn, oh, when I go on Facebook, it feels good. So when they go back from vacation, or maybe they're in the middle of finals, and their brain says, this is terrible. I don't want to study for this, this really boring Hebrew Bible class or whatever. And then so they start going on Facebook to feel better. And you can see they go on to do social media to regulate their mood. And of course, it doesn't help them get better grades. It actually leads to negative outcomes. In fact, there's a linear correlation between the adjusted odds ratio of becoming depressed and social media use. You can see this in the global frequency scale. So there's something that's not actually that helpful when our brain gets sucked into these habit loops. So this is where it gets interesting from a psychological perspective. We started wondering, well, how far back does this behavior trace? And in fact, when we looked at some ancient Buddhist psychology, we saw something very, very interesting. The way they describe this, they used a term called dependent origination, which basically means that this depends on this, depends on this. And they said that, okay, there are these triggers that come into our mind that get evaluated as either pleasant or unpleasant. So, let's use a different example. We're cookies. We eat a cookie, tastes good, and then we start to learn, oh, that feels good. I want more cookies, and so we continue eating cookies. Or we feel stressed out during exams. That feels bad. We have a craving or an urge to make that unpleasant feeling go away, so we eat some cookies to feel better. The way they described this in ancient times was this leads to the birth of a self-identity, which is really interesting. We think of this in modern day as memory, but we start becoming identified with our behaviors. Oh, if I feel bad and I eat cookies, I'll feel a little bit better. And so we start wearing what in modern day we call subjective bias glasses, where we start to see the world through the lens of our previous experiences. Okay, if I feel bad and I eat cookies, I'll feel better. We start walking around with these cookie glasses on. So if we feel bad, we are more likely to eat cookies. And this gets reinforced. In ancient times, they actually described this loop using the term samsara. How many of you have heard that term before? So a few of you. So literally translated, samsara means endless wandering, which is interesting because cookies don't generally fix the source of our stress. They don't make our grades better. They don't fix our relationships or whatever it was that caused that stress. And so the emphasis here in ancient times was really this identification. And they describe this as we start forming a sense of self around these behaviors. Modern-day philosopher Alan Watts put it nicely. He says, ego, the self which she has believed herself or himself to be, is nothing but a pattern of habits. So with this as a framework, we can start to think about how does this actually manifest in the brain. So I'll continue with a little bit of a story. This is actually perfect because of the Winter Olympics are happening right now. So this is a woman, Lolo Jones, who some of you might be familiar with her name. She was favored. She was an Olympic hurdler, a three-time Olympian. Was actually in the running to be on the women's bobsled team this year, but I don't think she made the cut. So in 2008, she was favored to win the hurdles. In fact, she'd made it to the finals. She was in the finals, and in the lead at the 9th of 10 hurdles. And in an interview with Time magazine, she said, I'll just read you what she said. She said, I was just in an amazing rhythm, and then I knew at one point I was winning the race. It wasn't like, oh, I'm winning the Olympic gold medal. It just seemed like another race. And then there was a point after that where I was telling myself to make sure my legs were snapping out. So I overtried. That's when I hit the hurdle. So the critical piece here is not that she was having thoughts. It's one of the big misnomers or misconceptions around mindfulness. It's, oh, if I could be mindful, I could just rid myself of thinking, and then I would win, or whatever ridding our mind of thoughts would do for us. But this is really about pointing out this relationship where she became identified or literally tripped herself up with getting caught up in her thoughts. Or as one teacher put it, your me is in the way. So let's think about this pragmatically. What do we mean by getting caught up? You can think of this as a spectrum. So for example, there was a study that showed that 50% of waking life, we're often a daydream. We're thinking about the past or the future. And so if you pay attention even to half of this lecture, or don't check your, or go to check your social media for only a couple of times this lecture, you're actually doing better than the general population. So when we're caught up in daydreaming and then somebody says, hey, snap out of it, you should have been paying attention, we can snap out relatively easily. So that caught upness isn't that sticky. You can think further along the spectrum when we're a little stressed out. Wouldn't it be great if somebody could say, hey, snap out of it? And we're like, oh, thank you, that was great. Do that more often. So when we're stressed out, we're a little more caught up. It's a little harder to let go. And if you think of the far end of that spectrum, addiction, I like the simple definition, continued use despite adverse consequences, where we're continually using, even knowing and being fully aware of it, but have completely lost control. This is where a lot of my patients are at, where they're just totally sucked into these habitual behaviors where they have no control. So there's a caught upness that even awareness has no help with. And we can actually experience this. So we'll do an experiment together here for 30 seconds, and we're going to see if we can replicate a study that was done in Europe a couple of years ago. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to just think of a time recently when you were either really afraid or really anxious, okay? And so think of that time, and when you think of that and you can picture that in your mind, check into your body and see where you feel that the most, okay? And with one mental finger, you point to where you feel that most strongly in your body. And then I'm going to show you an aggregate picture of basically what this study was doing. So everybody got that in their mind? Okay, so what I'm going to show you is a heat map, which means a probability function where they map out how many people pointed to the same place the most. The yellow means the hottest, means the most people pointed to that same place. Are you ready? So for fear, for those of you that remembered a time when you were afraid, you feel it in your chest, or is it somewhere in this area? If you did, you're exactly reporting the exact same way as these 800 people that were in this study. How about with anxiety? Very similar. Interesting. Now, we can actually feel that contraction that happens when we even recall these things or when they're happening in real time, which actually makes sense. If something is bearing down on us and it's very dangerous, our job is to become as small as possible and protect our vital organs. And so you can imagine this contraction that happens, whether it's through some real threat or even an imagined one. And if this is so common, this caught upness, when we get caught up in fear or caught up in anxiety, we can actually map it out in the brain. There's a network called the default mode network, okay? And this is a busy slide, so don't worry about the details. But what I'm showing here is a hub of brain regions that are all interconnected and talk to each other during different things. And what I'm going to point out here is these two, you can see these yellow blobs. These are the central hubs of this default mode network. One's the medial prefrontal cortex, which is kind of here, and then the other is the posterior cingulate cortex, which is a little farther back. But both of these are midline brain structures. Just as a reminder, yes, the posterior cingulate is that brain region that was activated during that Instagram study. And in fact, it's been shown that this brain region gets activated during a number of different tasks, and I'll show you that in a minute. But I'll just give you some examples here. It gets activated when people who are addicted to cocaine are shown videos of people smoking crack cocaine. You can see it activated here. It lights up like a Christmas tree when people who are addicted to nicotine are shown pictures of people smoking. And it even gets activated when people who are pathological gamblers are shown images and pictures of people gambling. And in a study done by one of my friends, one of my friends at Yale, who did this for her PhD thesis. This was a great study. So imagine you're a PhD student, and you're trying to figure out what would be a fun project to do. Okay, I'm going to do something with chocolate, because I like chocolate. So she went and found all these different types of chocolate, and what she did was she got people to come into her PET scanner. She fed them their favorite pieces of chocolate while she was imaging their brain, and then asked them to rate how well they liked it. And you can imagine, I'd sign up for this study. You can imagine they're in that PET scanner, they're getting paid to eat their favorite chocolate. So of course they're going to say, this is awesome, this is great. And so they're rating, 10 out of 10, this is delicious. Then they get some more, and they're like, this is really good. They get some more, this is great. They get some more, they're thinking, how long does this experiment go? Get some more, and they're thinking, is this ethical? Did these guys get IRB approval for this? And then, she keeps going and going and going, and they're like, get me out of here, this is terrible. I hate this, I don't want any more. I can't, yes, this is my favorite chocolate, and right now I want to throw it and you across the room. So she could get people on both ends of the spectrum, and she could look at their brain activity. And the only brain region that was activated during I want more and I want out of here was the posterior cingulate cortex. Really, really interesting. And so I'm just going to list a bunch of different studies that activate this part of the brain. You don't have to remember them, but just look at all the different ways that this brain region gets activated. And so one of my collaborators and I started thinking about, well, how can we actually link all of this stuff together? Is there any parsimonious explanation for this? And so we started working with this working hypothesis around self-referential processing because we knew it was involved in self-referential processing. Is this actually a brain region involved in kind of getting caught up in our experience? Is this where we start to form an experiential sense of self? This getting caught up in experience. And this is where mindfulness comes in, because we can actually start to study ways to perturb this system. And so just for those of you that aren't familiar with some of the common definitions, John Kabat-Zinn coined this in terms of the awareness that arises when we pay attention in the present moment, on purpose and non-judgmentally. And you can think of this, if you think back to those that pathway of the want more and want less, we can think of this as being aware of whatever's happening, but not getting pushed or pulled by it, not getting sucked into the I want more, and not getting repelled by the I want less of this. And in fact, we could argue that the task of mindfulness training is to help us not get caught up in this sense of self, or this identification with these emotions. So we did a study a couple of years ago where we took novice and experienced meditators, and we studied their brain activity during a bunch of different types of meditation. And we were really interested in seeing what brain regions got activated when they were meditating. And we were thinking, yeah, there's going to be this brain region that gets activated. And I can't actually show you our first finding because it was a null result. We didn't actually find anything, which was there was no brain region that was activated more in experienced meditators versus novices. So they weren't doing something during meditation. But in fact, what we found was something very interesting when we looked at the opposite effects. Was there something that was less activated in experienced meditators compared to novices? And here's where it got really interesting. When we looked across the entire brain, there were only 4 regions that were different between these two groups. And 2 of those 4 were these 2 hubs of the default mode network. So there was something interesting about this sense of self that was decreasing, or at least these brain regions were getting deactivated in experienced versus novice meditators. Now, this was puzzling to us, and as some of you might know the physicist Richard Feynman, he says, you know, it's so easy to fool yourself, especially if you're a scientist and you want to figure something out. So you need to figure out ways not to do that. So one of my colleagues at Yale, Zenius Papademetris, developed this technique where we could actually give people feedback from their brains in real time while they were meditating. Okay? So this is a pretty cool thing to do. We could actually do a bunch of control experiments to make sure they weren't fooling themselves. I'm not going to show you the results of those right now. But in essence, it's a way that we can start to link up people's subjective experience with their brain activity and cross this chasm of first-person and third-person science. And I'll show you I'll show you a short video clip actually from when Anderson Cooper came into our lab to actually do this on film. At this point, we'd moved from fMRI to EEG, but the same techniques are the same.
This is just the next generation of exercise. We've got the physical, exercise components down, and now it's about working out how can we actually train our minds.
Dr. Brewer is trying to understand how mindfulness can alter the functioning of the brain. He uses a cap lined with 128 electrodes.
We're going to start filling each of these 128 wells with conduction gel.
The electrodes are able to pick up signals from the posterior cingulate, part of a brain network linked to memory and emotion.
This is all just picking up a signal from the top of your head.
Since attending the mindfulness retreat, I'd been meditating daily and was curious to see if it had an impact on my brain.
We're going to have you start with thinking of something that was very anxiety-provoking for you.
Okay.
When I thought about something stressful, the cells in my brain's posterior cingulate immediately started firing, shown by the red lines that went off the chart on the computer screen.
Just drop into meditation.
Okay.
When I let go of those stressful thoughts and refocused on my breath, within seconds the brain cells that had been firing quieted down, shown by the blue lines on the computer.
That's really fascinating to see like that.
Dr. Brewer believes everyone can train their brains to reach that blue mindfulness zone, but he says all the technology we're surrounded by makes it difficult.
So you can get a sense for how this tool can be really, really helpful for us to really directly probe how brain regional activity is actually lining up with subjective experience. I'll show you an example. So we can ask people after each run, so these are 1-minute runs where they meditate and then they report directly thereafter on what their experience was. So here's an example. This person said, at the beginning I caught myself, I was trying to guess when the words were going to end, that was our baseline task, and when the meditation was going to begin, so I was kind of trying to be like, okay, ready, set, go, and there was an additional word that popped up, and I was like, oh, shit. And there's this red spike you see there. And then I sort of immediately settled in and was really getting into it. And then I thought, oh my gosh, this is amazing. It's describing exactly what I'm saying. And then you see this red spike. I was like, okay, don't get distracted. And I got back into it and got blue again. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is unbelievable. It's doing exactly what my mind's doing. So he's laughing at this point. And he said, so I found it really funny because to the next question, that's a perfect map of what my mind was going through. So this was really interesting where we can start to really map out what these brain regions are doing. So for example, this person said, I worried I wasn't using the graph as an object of meditation, so I tried to look at it harder or somehow pay attention more. This is when it went red. It's like, oh, trying, huh? Look at these. This person said, toward the middle, I had some thoughts I don't see on the graph, maybe because I let them flow by. I noticed the more I relaxed and stopped trying to do anything, the bluer it went. So this is really interesting. This actually answered one of my questions that I had since childhood, which was, what the heck was Yoda talking about, right? He's talking about doing as compared to trying, or in Luke Skywalker's case, whining, which certainly doesn't help anything. So it gets really interesting, and we can actually start to see what these brain regions link up with. So what these people were starting to report, and I won't go into the details, was basically this brain regions get activated when we're caught up in our experience, when we're trying to force things, when, all of this stuff. And in fact, if you take the opposite of contraction, which is expansion, what happens then? So if we think of the self as, okay, now I know where my boundaries between me and the rest of the world are, and you start to break those boundaries down through this expanded quality that can happen with meditation, that can happen with types of selfless love and other types of things, what happens? Well, there's a psychologist, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, that described this state of flow. You hear a lot of athletes talk about this. I think Michaela Schifrin, in some interview that we were watching a couple of days ago, described, where she's totally in the zone, where she doesn't hear a thing, and she's just there when she's skiing. That's what Mihai Csikszentmihalyi was talking about. When we lose all sense of self, that was part of his definition of flow. There's selflessness, it's effortlessness, it's joyful. That's what he describes as flow. And we can think of this as this boundary becoming so large that we lose who we are. And in fact, we had some experienced meditators get into flow completely spontaneously while they were in our fMRI scanner. So we can think of it, we got a snapshot of that, what that looks like, at least with this brain activity in this brain region. You can see here, this person said, being with the breath, flow deepened in the middle, and you can see how the posterior cingulate activity was dropping quite a bit. So I don't want to belabor this point, and we can think, okay, a bunch of experienced meditators, you can line their brain activity up with their, with what's going on, so what? And in fact, these folks in general, not Anderson Cooper, but these folks in general had been practicing a lot. And so you might be asking, do I have to practice 10,000 hours to change my default mode? Well, in fact, this is where I turn to, sorry to use sports analogies, but Vince Lombardi. He was the guy that they hand the Lombardi trophy out at the Super Bowl. He was the first Super Bowl winner. He talks about perfect practice, not just practicing, right? And so we can start to think of this more as, what are the ingredients that we bring together to be mindful as compared to doing something? So we've talked a lot about paying attention. What else can we bring together? So here's an experiment with a novice meditator. So just learned to meditate that morning. These are 3 minutes runs. So you can see here, 3 minutes, 6 minutes, 9 minutes, brain transplant, right? No, we don't have IRB approval for that. So what happened to his brain? How did his brain look completely different after 9 minutes? So we asked him, and he said, oh, well, I felt a lot more relaxed, like it was less of a struggle to prevent my mind from wandering. So he'd actually learned something from this feedback. Well, in fact, what he was describing, what the ancient Buddhist psychologists would call is the fifth factor of awakening. So the term for it is passaddhi, which translated means relaxation or tranquility. And so he actually had found this condition that supported him letting go, and it was reflected beautifully in his brain activity dropping. Here's an experienced meditator who is focusing on the breath, and in particular, this feeling of interest, wonder, and joy that arises in conjunction with subtle mindful breathing. And look at his brain. So what he was describing was the second and fourth factors of awakening. So the second one is interest or curiosity or wonder. I would even put awe in that category. It might be a little bit of a stretch, but that's where I would put that. And what happens when we're interested? What happens when we're curious? Well, this joy arises because, wow, what is this? What is this? What is this? I think this is one of the beautiful aspects of wonder, of awe, of really something that's much, where we get out of our own way and into something much greater. And I'd love to talk more specifically about that in the question and answer piece. So here's a novice meditator. One more example. He said, I was thinking about my breath, but my brain activity increased. So he actually said, I don't think your feedback thing works. Very next run, he said, oh, I get it. Focused more on the physical sensations instead of thinking in and out. So he was literally, he was getting out of his own way. So learning, oh, it's not about me thinking, doing, whatever. It's about just dropping into my direct experience. And then his brain activity was very, very different. So just to bring this part of the talk to a close, what we can do, and also putting on my clinical hat now, if we can understand some of these brain mechanisms, we can start to develop ways to provide these mental mirrors so people can learn from their own direct experience. This is exactly what neuroscience is for. And so we're just finished up a study and are analyzing data where we did a neurofeedback study where we gave people feedback from their posterior cingulate as they were starting to learn meditation as a way to help them get this mental mirror to see what's actually happening, to see if that could help them really more clearly identify when they're caught up with that and what that feels like, as well as when they're letting go. So now I'm going to shift gears and talk a little bit about how we can think and start applying this clinically, and then we'll finish up at the end about how this all comes together with the self. So I'm going to show you a short Weight Watchers commercial, and we'll see how this fits in.
If you're happy and you know it, eat a snack. If you're happy and you know it, eat a snack. If you're happy and you know it, then your face will surely show it. If you're happy and you know it, eat a snack. If you're sad and you know it, eat a snack. If you're sad and you know it, eat a snack. If you're sad because you're angry, feeling down, or generally bad, if you're sad, eat a snack. If you're bored and you know it, eat a snack. If you're lonely and you know it, eat a snack. If you're sleepy and you know it, if you're stressed, eat a snack. If you're human and you know it, then your face will surely show it. If you're human, eat your feelings, eat a snack.
So how many of you have seen this commercial? Anybody? Yeah. Rarely do people say they've seen this. A friend sent this to me. She found it on YouTube. And when I was talking to somebody at Weight Watchers Corporate, I said, this is amazing. You've really nailed this habit loop. Why don't we see this on television? And she said, oh, it makes people depressed. Nothing against Weight Watchers, but I guess the point system doesn't quite cut it here. So what are they talking about? This is a beautiful and very witty example of what these ancient Buddhist psychologists were talking about way back before paper was even invented. In modern day, we call this operant conditioning. For those of you that have taken Psychology 101, whether it's high school or here, this is positive and negative reinforcement. This is what B.F. Skinner became famous for when he invented what's called the Skinner box, because you shock an animal in this box, and they prefer the box where they're not shocked. And so they prefer things that are not painful. And so this is what we're talking about, positive and negative affect, where we want things that make us feel better, and we want things that make us feel bad to go away as quickly as possible. So from a mechanistic perspective, it's really helpful to understand this. And also from a clinical perspective, it helps us be able to treat our patients. So for example, for my patients who are addicted to alcohol, there's this saying, people, places, and things. If you avoid people, places, and things, such as bars and drinking buddies and the package store, you're less likely to drink. Duh, right? And they're like, yeah, duh. Easier said than done. But you can see mechanistically how that might work, because if we avoid these cues are less likely to trigger us into these behaviors. With behaviors such as smoking, for example, it's a little harder to avoid our front porch, our car, outside of work, and all the different places that we smoke. And so there are different strategies that come in. So for example, substitute strategies, eat some candy instead of smoking, and we can see how that works as well. But the fact is that from a clinical perspective, and we're right in the midst of an opioid epidemic, there really aren't good treatments for addictions. If you try to quit smoking, if you smoke and you try to quit, the likelihood that you're going to stay quit at the end of the year? Guess. 20%. 5%. Yes. And the rest of the addictions, about the same. Okay? So trying to do these substitute things doesn't necessarily work, especially because we need our higher order thinking parts of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, to make those work, and that actually goes offline when we get stressed out. So here we can actually turn back to the ancient Buddhist psychologist and say, hey guys, help me, Obi-Wan. You're my only hope. So when you look at some of the ancient writings, they had some really interesting things to say. And here's one of the parts of the Pali Canon, so some of the canonical teachings of the Buddha. Just as a tree, though cut down, can grow again and again if its roots are undamaged and strong, in the same way, if the roots of craving are not wholly uprooted, sorrows will come again and again. So they were actually highlighting that key element of craving. And if we don't work with that, if we treat around it, we might not actually see a lot of progress. I like this modern day interpretation a little bit more. You get the idea, right? So if we distill this down to its most basic elements, and this is something, if you remember nothing else from this lecture, I would say remember these three things and start mapping out your own life to see how much this is true for you. We need a trigger, we need a behavior, and then we get a reward. This is called reward-based learning. This is operant conditioning. This is positive and negative reinforcement in a nutshell. Get stressed out, eat cupcake, get some brief relief, repeat, right? So if we know that mechanistically, this can be tremendously powerful. So who knows this mechanistically? Well, the food industry, right? And they actually flaunt this. There's McDonald's, there's Kellogg's, there's Milk Chocolate Crave, and if Milk Chocolate Crave isn't good enough, don't worry, there's Double Chocolate Crave. And we all know where this leads, right? So it's really interesting. And in fact, if you haven't read this, there was an expose in the New York Times a couple of years ago, and I love how they actually use the Dorito as the marquee piece, because this is completely manufactured. And in fact, if you read the Onion, the satirical journal, they had a headline, Doritos celebrates its 1 millionth ingredient. Because this is perfectly engineered to be the right color, size, shape, smell, crunch, taste, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Here's my summary slide of this part so far, right? So understanding mechanism is really, really critical. Yes, poor Cookie Monster. So if we understand mechanism, we can actually start to bring in treatments that actually target the problem, right? And so if we think about, from a mechanistic perspective, how this stuff works, we can say, okay, how can we target this? And at the Center for Mindfulness, we think of these awareness practices as a way to bring this wedge of awareness in so that we have the space to respond rather than habitually react. Okay, and so we hypothesize that it actually comes and helps us be able to see these cravings, work with them, rather than habitually react to them. But this might seem a little far-fetched, and it certainly did, to me as well as an addiction psychiatrist. I want to see how can this actually help people change their behavior. So we did a bunch of clinical studies. First ones were with alcohol and cocaine dependence, worked pretty well. We did another one with smoking, which is actually the hardest addiction to quit. We can talk more about that later. But we brought people in, they didn't even know they were getting mindfulness training. They were randomized to gold standard treatment or mindfulness, and then we did something crazy. We said, go ahead and smoke. And they looked at us like, is this the experiment? I came here to quit smoking. And in fact, they tried to quit smoking 5 to 7 times before they came to our study and couldn't do it. Well, we gave that one little twist. We said, well, go ahead and smoke, but pay attention as you smoke. And what did they notice? Here's an example. Somebody said, just doing the mindful smoking exercise, she said, smells like stinky cheese and tastes like chemicals. Yuck. So this is really, really critical. She wasn't using the thinking part of her brain. She was dropping into her direct experience. And she was realizing, it really isn't that great. And what she was doing and what we were specifically, getting folks to do was to tap into this same reward-based learning process. And here's one of the things that people don't really quite get with reward-based learning. It's based on rewards. It's not based on the behavior. So we think, oh, if I need to change my behavior, I'm going to change my behavior. Well, that doesn't actually work from a neurobiologic standpoint. If we want to change our behavior, we need to understand how our brains work. And so we look at the reward. How rewarding is this? So if we smoke a cigarette and we see that it tastes really crappy, guess what? That reward value goes down. There's a part of the brain called the orbitofrontal cortex that's actually involved in reward valuation and holding that value in mind. Well, as we pay attention more and more, it becomes less valuable, and our brain says, why are you going to keep doing that? We don't have to convince ourselves to stop smoking. Our brains naturally take care of the process for us. Or as another sage, Yogi Berra, put it, you can observe a lot just by watching. So I won't go through all the details of our clinical study, but I can say that it works pretty well. In fact, we had 5 times the quit rates of gold standard treatment at our 4-month follow-up. So we were pretty excited by that. And we also dove into the mechanism, which will totally bore you, so I won't go through it right now. But we said, well, okay, so if this works, how can we actually start to help people clinically? And I would look out my office window. I was working at the VA hospital at the time. We were on a smoke-free campus. And I would see my patients out in the parking lot smoking. So they have a cigarette in one hand, and what did they have in their other hand? Yes. So we said, okay, this mechanism is actually designed for context-dependent memory. It was set up so we'd remember where food is, right? That's how this process works, is, you eat some food, you get this dopamine surge from your stomach, and your stomach triggers this dopamine cascade in your brain, and it says, remember what you ate and where you found it. This is context-dependent memory. That's where reward-based learning comes from. So people don't learn to smoke or use cocaine in my office. So why are they going to come to my office to quit smoking? It's actually an artificial environment. What if I take my office to them? And so we said, okay, well, if you're already holding this thing, let's actually put something useful on there as compared to YouTube or whatever. So we started developing digital therapeutics where we could actually take these manualized trainings, cut them into bite-sized pieces, and deliver training right at people's fingertips. Now, before I dive into this a little bit more, one thing I want to point out is, for example, so we developed a smoking program, one for eating, and then one for anxiety. And you might think, what? Anxiety? A habit? So anxiety is really interesting because it turns out, and I won't go through all the details, but I'll give you the summary. When we are afraid or have some unpleasant emotion or thought, our brain kicks in and starts thinking. And it says, I'm going to fix this. So we start worry thinking. And so we start feeling like we're in control, or it's a distraction from that unpleasant emotion. Well, guess what? If the worry thinking doesn't actually fix the problem, how rewarding is it? It actually loses its reward value. And in fact, when it gets so unrewarding, it can become a trigger for itself, because worry becomes unpleasant, and then our brain says, well, worry, and then we go over this event horizon into the black hole of anxiety. I'll give you an example from somebody in one of our clinical programs. He or she said, I think of my to-do list or projects and conversations. I feel as though somehow the anxiety is trying to offer some control. For all you students in the audience, just take a moment and think about how much this might relate to you, right? Oh, this is going to help me control my exam anxiety, okay? So we can take these programs, I'll just show you how this works. We can give people short bite-sized pieces in the moment every day, like 10 minutes a day, where we can help them understand their minds and help link up how this relates to mindfulness practice. We can give them animations. I'll show you an example of this in a minute. And then we can have them in the moment that they're caught up, whether it's a craving to eat or smoke or caught up in anxiety, give them in the moment exercises so they can start to unlearn those old habitual behaviors. And of course, as a scientist, I'd like to track progress and see how well this actually works, so we can embed experience sampling questionnaires into these things as well. Here's an example of how we actually deliver this. So this is a short animation.
Today we're going to explain cravings through the metaphor of a screaming child. I know you've heard and seen a child throwing a tantrum. Perhaps for some of you, it was your own child. This child is screaming because he wants something, and you as the parent want him to stop screaming. All your child wants is a lollipop. So in this metaphor, think of your cravings as the child's tantrum. The lollipop is like the cigarettes. But what should you do? Yell at the child? That might make things worse. Gag the child? That will stop the screaming in the short term, but you know what will happen as soon as you take the gag away. You could just give him a lollipop. Congratulations, you've just taught your child to scream for lollipops. In other words, you just taught him that screaming is a good way to get what he wants. What might you do instead? Here's a novel concept. Just let him scream himself out. What? Have you ever seen a child scream forever? Sometimes they scream so hard and so long that you think their head, or your head, might explode. But it never does. What happens instead? Eventually, the child gets tired and stops.
Okay, so you get an idea of how we can, these are actually relatively straightforward and simple concepts, but can be tremendously difficult when we get in our own way and try to think our way through them. So we can use simple ways to explain them so that people can get them. And the other disclaimer here is I'm not advocating child abuse here. So obviously, when our child, whether it's our actual child or our inner child, has needs, this isn't to say ignore those needs, but it's to help us really identify what we actually need versus what we want. And in fact, with our eating program, we found when I was doing some pilot testing with my clinical population, they actually couldn't determine the difference between what we describe as homeostatic hunger, where hungry because you're actually hungry, versus hedonic hunger, which is hungry because of an emotion, whether we're sad or we're angry or we're bored or we're stressed. And so in fact, they had to actually relearn what this felt like. And so we used stealth mindfulness practices, just asking them, well, do you feel this, this, or this, to help them start to relearn and separate the process so they could really start to understand from their own experience, oh yeah, I'm actually hungry now. Oh yeah, I'm actually stressed now. And in fact, when we did a clinical study of this, this was led by one of my collaborators at UCSF, Ashley Mason, we were looking at mechanism but also feasibility. We found that you could actually help people reduce craving-related eating by 40% by helping them map out these simple processes and then use some mindfulness practices to be able to work with them. And I'll show you how this works in a minute. We just got some pilot data back from our anxiety program. We get close to a 50% reduction in anxiety. These are clinically validated anxiety scales. This is the Generalized Anxiety 7, which is a clinical instrument that we use for that. So we're starting to see that we can see these mechanisms line up, whether it's smoking, whether it's eating, and even with anxiety, leading to real clinical effects. So how do we conceptualize all of this? And I'll just use this to finish up the talk. We think of this as these 3 gears of awareness. So if you think of riding a bicycle or driving a car, if we're stuck in our habit loop, that's like we're going in reverse. But the first time we wake up and see that we're in a habit loop, we're already in first gear. We're aware that we're caught up in a habit loop. That's it. We're already moving forward because by observing, we're affecting the result. Second gear happens when we start to explore the results of our behaviors, these rewards, so that our brains can recalibrate. And so we have them ask simple questions like, what do I get from this? Not intellectually, but really seeing what the results of their behavior are. So whether it's smoking a cigarette, eating that 12th cookie, getting caught up in the worry thought loop or whatever, this helps folks become disenchanted with behaviors that aren't that helpful and also become more enchanted with behaviors that are. So for example, as they shift into what we describe as third gear, where they actually step out of the habit loop, they can bring in practices like loving kindness, which is just basically Buddhist terminology for the Christian term agape, or selfless love, where we're really offering and living in this sense of selfless love, which really feels like this as compared to this contracted quality of I want more. And I'll give you some examples of how this works. So if we think of reverse gear, this can get to the point where we can even become afraid of our own bodily sensations. So this person said, I become afraid of my bodily sensations. That's how strong this person's anxiety was. So we shift into first gear simply by recognizing these habit loops. And here's an example. So we have people keep journals on our online community so we can really see them describe this in their own experience. This person said, I understand why I go to food, to avoid or cover up or distract from uncomfortable feelings, such as anger, sadness, or restlessness. Who wants to feel those things? Trigger, uncomfortable feeling. Behavior, eat something that temporarily diminishes the feeling. Reward, still have to deal with the unpleasant feelings, plus the sugar headache. I can clearly see how I got caught in this habit loop trying to escape difficult feelings with food, but that ultimately it doesn't work. So they're actually describing this in their own language, which is really helpful for us to see that they've internalized these trainings as compared to parroting them back to us. The parroting back piece in medical school, we used to call that academic bulimia, where we had to learn all this information, and then we would binge on that, and then we would purge whatever that organ system was so that we could learn the next organ system, because our brains just couldn't hold all that information at once. And so really helping people internalize this and see this and feel this in their bones is really useful to see that this is likely to last for a while. So after they start identifying their habit loops, then they can shift into second gear and start exploring the results of their behavior. I like this one. This person said, "Dear sneaky habit loop that says eating junk food is fun, I am onto you," right? And so they start to realize, this person says, the food is distracting. It also can create a pleasant shift for a moment inside. But then you need more food, more distraction. So they're starting to see that they're not actually, this isn't actually fixing the problem. They're clearly linking up the results of their behavior with their behavior. They're starting to recalibrate their brains. Or as this person in our smoking program said, today all the cigarettes I smoked were disgusting. So as we get into second gear, this helps give us momentum to shift into third gear, where we can bring in things that are less self-focused or less caught up in those habit loops and really tap into these rewards that are more rewarding. I like this quote. This wasn't from our program. "I really regret eating healthy today," said no one ever, right? So it actually feels good when we're eating stuff that's not manufactured, and we can actually pay attention to that. And we start to see things like this person said, "A shift is happening. I'm choosing more healthy foods. The sugary things are less attractive. Satiety is now coming into focus." And in fact, we can even hack this process. So if we think of these diminishing rewards of these unhealthy habits, we can also start to see very clearly the benefits of things that actually feel good. And this gives a bigger differential for our brain to say, wow, this is really good compared to this. Here's an example. This person said, "What's most interesting to me is how we define the rewards. In the past, the reward of eating right had been weight loss, but it was more often than not short-lived because I hadn't made real process changes in my daily life. Here it feels like the reward is defined differently, and weight loss is a side effect. The reward here is, for a lack of a better expression, a more balanced life or inner peace." Isn't that interesting? Here's another example. When I began the program, I described myself and believed that I wasn't an anxious person. I now describe that I have anxious body sensations. This is not simply some linguistic mumbo-jumbo. It's a huge shift in my holding of myself and my ability to be with what is. And so you can see very clearly here less of an identification with a certain type of mental behavior, anxiety in this case. So let's just bring all of this to a close. If you remember the clinical vignette that I told you at the beginning, my patient had come in meeting all the criteria for binge eating disorder. We started to help her learn to pay attention to these things, to start driving in these different gears. She went through the program. About a year later, she came back. She'd lost 40 pounds. But more importantly than that, she said, I actually have my life back. I can eat a single piece of pizza and actually enjoy it. And so it wasn't that she had to avoid these things. It was that she had an understanding, a disenchantment, and then, I hate to use the word control, but her mind was less in control of her. Let's put it that way. And actually, somebody in one of our eating programs said, I was so identified with my old habit loops that I've lost that identification that I don't know who I am anymore. Or as Alice would put it, curiouser and curiouser. Or as she also put it, it's no use going back to yesterday because I was a different person then. So let's bring this to a close. Hoika asks Bodhidharma, he says, "My mind is not at ease. Please pacify my mind." Bodhidharma says, "Bring me your mind and I will pacify it. When I look for my mind, and when I look for who I am, I cannot find it. There, I have pacified it for you." Or as Thomas Merton put, "Finally, I'm coming to the conclusion that my highest ambition is to be what I already am, that I will never fulfill my obligation to surpass myself unless I first accept myself. And if I accept myself fully in the right way, I will have already surpassed myself. Or, to quote a book that you all are very familiar with, have the same mind among yourselves that was in Christ Jesus, who, though in the form of God, did not consider equality with God something to be clung to for his own advantage. Rather, he emptied himself. And so, with that, I would like to end and thank all of the folks that contributed to our work, namely all of our subjects who literally donated their brains for this, and our funders, the NIH. So please write your congresspeople and remind them that science is real. And if you're interested in learning any more about this stuff, I'll give a shameless plug of self-promotion. I wrote a book about this recently, and it highlights all of these things in a hopefully accessible way. So I will stop there, and I think we've got time to take questions and explore this, especially this relationship between science and spirituality, which many people often try to keep at distance, and I think this is a travesty, and this is really where it gets very, very interesting and awe-inspiring. So thank you very much, even if you only paid attention 50% of the time.
We have about 20 minutes for questions. If you would wait
I can take my own, yeah, sure. Great.
We could have a question from a student first.
Everyone has transcended their self.
Yeah. So I just had a question of like clarification on that Dao Zu thing that you mentioned.
Yes.
So when the Buddhist monk tells him that his mind has been purified, is it because of the realization that he, like that first gear, that he is searching for it, and that's why he's not improving himself, and that's why the Buddhist monk tells him that now he's sort of pacified it, because he's now aware that it's something that's lost on him. So is that what you meant, just to like clarify? Because I don't want to like get the like bad interpretation of it.
Of course. And these stories, especially in Zen, are said as koans, as riddles for our minds to sit with and puzzle. And so this is something that we can all continue to puzzle. So if you look at Hoika, where he was, he says, my mind is not at ease. And so he was so identified with his mind that he was saying, oh, here's my mind, and it's not at ease. And so Bodhidharma said, well, where is your mind? And so through that looking, I think it's called a positive negation. When it cannot be found, the thing, if it was ephemeral, if that thing was a concept or being clung to, and we see that it's not part of our reality, then it just naturally, it can dissolve. And so he says, when I look for my mind, I cannot find it. And so when he looks for something that's not there, it's not a problem at that point. It's only when he's so identified with it that it's a problem. And this is something, that we can all experience. Like anytime, somebody says, whatever it is, if I ask a question in a lecture and the lecturer says, oh, that's a terrible question, and I'm like, oh, I become identified with, oh, I thought that was a good question. And that causes suffering for me. If I see, oh, that was just a question, and I'm not attached to that, then I don't suffer based on it. So we can even see how this happens even in small times. It's not that we have to become enlightened, or whatever, like Hoika was working with, but we can just see how much suffering is caused moment to moment to moment as we cling to the identification with different things. And I think, to be provocative, this is where, so this is great because I want to provoke you guys, so you can tell me this is a stupid interpretation. I can see how attached I am to it. My wife and I talk a lot about this this small self in Christian terms, where when we become identified with our, the small self, this is where we distance ourselves from God. And if we can empty the small self, we can let God flow through us. And I think that's very much experientially along the same lines of what Bodhidharma and Hoike were talking about. So this is something for us to contemplate, to not actually try to figure out here, but to really live. Oh, what happens when I'm identified with something? Am I distancing myself, or am I suffering? So it's something to chew on, perhaps. So thanks for the question. It was a great question.
Thank you.
Good question.
Hi, thank you so much for coming, first of all. My question was about how age goes along with mindfulness. I was wondering if you see a difference between the way adolescents versus young adults versus adults, how they deal with mindfulness and how they respond to that sort of self-reflection.
That's a great question. And so there are a lot of studies that are now ongoing with adolescents and even children with mindfulness. So a lot of the research is ongoing and not been reported yet. But there is more known about the development of a sense of self. It seems to start to come online about the age of 6 or 7. This is where the default mode network starts forming, and then it gets kind of locked into place more and more as we go through adolescence and then into young adulthood. And so it's a very it's a period of think of it as wet cement, where during adolescence and especially during college and whatnot, there's this opportunity for our brain networks and our habits to get kind of locked in as that cement starts to dry. And so we can see that this emergence of self and self-identity, I don't know if it was what this was like for you, but junior high school for me was hell. Right? That was like, I was so worried about, what am I wearing? What are they going to think of me? Am I in the right group, the wrong group, and et cetera? And now, in modern day, we're in this huge sociologic experiment because this is for the first time in history that we have junior high schoolers who have grown up native to social media. And so their job, and there's this great This American Life episode that describes, Ira Glass was interviewing these adolescents where they're talking about how their job is to present themselves to the world. And they're basically doing this. They're like, rats pressing levers, like, because they have to like all their friends' Instagram feeds. So we're in this massive sociologic experiment, and we have no idea what the result's going to be, but already preliminary data from the UK show that it's not going to end well. For adolescent women, the rates of anxiety and depression and body image stuff is much higher than it was before. So that piece is not great. What they're also doing well in the UK is they've actually incorporated mindfulness into their core national health system. And they're also starting large experiments with teaching it in schools. They call this the .B program, as in like stop, breathe. And so it'll be really, really interesting to see if we can train people to pay attention early on so they start to develop these resilience skills in school. And basically what they're doing is training kids to pay attention. So it's really as simple as that, and to learn distress tolerance, which often the kids' parents aren't teaching them because their parents are doing this as their own distress tolerance and modeling it for their kids, which is not a very good distress tolerance tool. So great question. Sorry to go on and on about that, but the short answer is we have no idea. But I think one of the few things that actually might get at the mechanism of all this stuff that's happening, sociologically, et cetera, is helping people learn how their minds work and then be able to work with their minds in that way. So thank you for the question. Hopefully in a couple of years we'll see some good results from that. Yeah. Behind you.
We've talked about cravings and such, which is a kind of suffering for the individual, although they may not acknowledge it. What about, let's say, real physical suffering or, say, a catastrophic illness that a person has to deal with over a period of time? Does this work with that kind of a situation?
That's a
Because it's a little hard to kind of forget yourself in the middle of pain?
Yes.
I would guess.
I think that's a great question. So there's a meditation teacher up in Vermont named Shinzen Young. And he has this, he's very mathematical about how he approaches things. And he has this equation that, you know, chalkboard, but basically suffering equals, see if I can write it backwards. Suffering equals pain times resistance, okay? And so we're talking about suffering here. And so there's pain, and if the resistance goes up, our suffering goes up. If our resistance to the pain goes down, our suffering goes down. So it doesn't necessarily fundamentally change the pain, but it might change our relationship, how much we resist the pain, because pain is unpleasant. Our brain says, make this go away. If we can learn to be with the pain, you know, instead of contracting around it, we might be able to open up to it so that whatever level of pain there is, it doesn't actually make the suffering worse. So that's really what we're talking about here. Does that make sense? Yeah. And something that we can all play with, right? This was actually the first studies that John Kabat-Zinn published were with people with chronic pain, showing that he gathered up all the patients from UMass that had intractable pain. Nobody could do it, you know, surgery, TENS units, drugs, nothing worked. 50% reduction in pain scores but because they were equating pain with suffering. So it's not necessarily that their pain was changing, but they were reporting pain as suffering. And when that suffering dropped, their perception of pain, of that suffering with pain, dropped as well. So some of the best data are actually out there with mindfulness and chronic pain. Yeah, it's a really great question.
Hi. So I wonder, I guess, about, like, I think obviously dealing with things we've already identified as bad habits and things we can identify as sort of not working. These are, you know, good techniques for weeding those out. But I wonder about, like, the limits of this letting go of the self. So some of my students are here, and we've got our students here, and you know, if I have moments where I can sort of lose myself in my work, and I, you know, really feel that flow and get into it. I have other times when I've got to show up because, you know, the college says this is when the semester starts, whether I'm feeling flow or not. And so it looks like I have to make myself do that. And I know as much as that happens to me, I know it happens even more to my students. I think they're even less likely to lose themselves in the moment of the things I'm excited by that I assigned for them. And so, it looks like sometimes that we do have to have ourselves there to regulate ourselves, and we can't just sort of lose ourselves and let go in this sort of meditative way. There's a reason your meditation subjects, right? They've practiced meditation, and they have the times at which they do that, and then they have the times at which they have to go to work, and they're usually not meditating there. So I guess where is the room for the self? Like, we've talked about getting the self out of the way, but it seems like we also have to make room for it.
It's such a great question. So, and we could unpack this several ways. And we could speak all day about this. But one really interesting finding that we had was with our first smoking study. And I went in with the hypothesis that formal meditation would actually rule the day. It would be better than informal practice because that's what I had trained in, you know, all this stuff. It turned out that formal meditation practice, whether it was loving kindness or breath awareness or body scan, was correlated with with outcomes. But in fact, the informal practices were even more useful. Where in the moment that somebody was caught up in whatever, when they were able to practice in those moments, they were able to let go, and that actually helped them change behavior. So we actually developed all of our digital therapeutics based on these informal practices that were then supported by formal practices. So we were following the data in that way. So how does this relate to your question? Well, the idea is to help us wake up to how painful it is to get caught up in, oh, I don't want to go to that class. Oh, I don't want to write that paper. Oh, I don't want to take that exam. Because guess what? We got to put on our pants and go to class. And so what if that's life, and we could learn to flow through life more seamlessly than resisting it every step of the way? Instead of going kicking and screaming to, I have to write this thing, I have to respond to these emails, I have to go to this class, we say, okay, here it is. And can I actually even dive into whatever it is, no matter how psychologically painful it might be. We might even start to change our relationship where these things that we thought were psychologically painful, or I don't want to do this, or I always want to be here. Well, what if we start to learn whatever is happening right now is the best that it gets, and I can actually start to tap into that sense of flow all the time. So that might seem far-fetched, but that's what our data are showing, even from very novice folks. Moment, moment, moments. These short moments many times are what help us to develop this habit of getting out of our own way, not as a formal meditative practice off in the corner in some cave somewhere, but right in the moment when I'm faced with a difficult problem on my final exam. Oh no, or oh, that can make all the difference. So that's what we're getting at. I don't know, and that could sound completely bogus to you, but that's what our data are showing us, and it's an empirical question. It's something we can all test out ourselves. This is a great question. Thank you.
Hi. I was wondering if you'd be able to distinguish mindfulness from stoicism for me.
If I could define stoicism, I could. But could you define stoicism? Because I can't.
I mean, I don't know. And there's certainly people in here that are better equipped to define stoicism than me. But my understanding of it is precisely, not allowing yourself to get caught up on too much joy or too much pain. Like you don't go to either extreme. Everything is in the middle. I know my brother-in-law did an experiment in college where his senior thesis was about stoicism, and he spent all 4 years shoeless in upstate Vermont.
Okay.
And like the whole thing was like, this is a pain that I'm going to live with, and I'm not going to allow myself to respond with all the stress and the tension that you get from like having cold feet, and you're just like, all right, I'm gonna keep going.
That sounds kind of masochistic.
It's
but I hope he got a good grade on his thesis. Okay, so
I think he did.
yeah, they're like, wow, just for the pain and suffering, you get extra credit. So if I understand correctly, as my wife was learning all the stuff for development of Western Civ, I was learning a little bit of this stuff about the Stoics. So I remember this concept of eudaimonia, and I think it might have been coined there, or at least used there, where there's this sense of, it's not excitement happiness, it's this I'm okay with stuff happiness. I'm okay walking around in freezing cold snow in Vermont. I'm not sure. Anyway, I would say put on your shoes. There are different ways to explore it. But I hope you didn't get any nerve damage from that. So from what I understand, that sounds very much, so it's this idea of not getting caught up in the highs and lows. In Buddhism, they actually have these, they call these the 8 vicissitudes, or the worldly winds, where it's like pleasure and pain, fame and disrepute, and all these too much of this and too much of this. What they're talking about is getting caught up in this and caught up in this. And I think, I'm guessing, and I'm not a stoic, I don't walk around barefoot in winter, and if it's about like really tapping into the being okay with what's happening, I would say that the Stoics were talking about the exact same thing that the Buddhists were talking about. That's what I would say, not being an expert in either of those, but it sounds pretty good to me. Does that fit with your, you can ask your brother. He might be able to answer better than I can.
We have time for one more question, and
right.
I just want to remind you all that we'll have a reception, as always, in the great room. Please join us after we're done for continuing the conversation. But now, just our final question.
So Dr. Leonard-Feldman asked this, that Colin can ask his question. Colin.
Okay.
Sorry. I just wanted to follow up on that great question about Stoicism. So Stoicism espouses the ideal of ataraxia, that's being unperplexed, unbothered by your emotions. And I just wanted to locate that development towards the emotions in the history of Greek culture, because it comes about in a time when people have less and less control over their environment. And so for Aristotle, for example, anger is a really important emotion because it's giving you information about the social context. So if a speaker makes you angry, you know something about the social context, and that's epistemically important. Whereas the Stoics are in a time where people sort of have to deal with a social system that they can no longer control. And that's where I see a great parallelism to Stoicism, where we're in this social system that we cannot control. So instead of taking our emotions as information, we just try to pacify them because it's a kind of pacifism. And that's how Stoicism is known. If you read A History of Ancient Philosophy and the Theory of Emotions, this is actually a sign of political decay and cultural decay in some way, this sort of backing out of our emotions. So there's, and of course, I grew up in a hippie commune with this kind of stuff as doctrine, so I'm well acquainted with it. But at the same time, I feel like there's a certain very problematic apolitical aspect to telling ourselves that we must simply stop feeling bad feelings. I think some of the greatest achievements of culture actually come out of feeling bad.
Yeah, so I love that. And are you wearing shoes? So not perplexed. So you're talking about they're not perplexed by the emotions. That's really what we're talking about in terms of not being caught up. And it gets really interesting. This, I think she was a psychologist, Carol Dweck, talked about fixed versus growth mindset. So when we're caught up or when we're perplexed by our emotions, we can't actually learn. But when we're not perplexed, we're open to learning. And so we can actually respond more skillfully. We can actually act more selflessly in a way when we're not stuck in our literally in our ruts of these old, these habit loops of self. And so what you're saying is really, I think it fits beautifully, this not being perplexed, if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly. The last piece that you said around the problematic, so problematic can you just unpack that for 4 more seconds? Yeah. 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 That makes so much sense, because if we avoid, like you're saying, if we avoid this stuff, we lose all the ability to connect with it and learn from it and grow from it. That's what I'm hearing. That's fixed mindset. If we can be open to negative emotions, for example, oh, what can I learn from this? So I love that word. It's beautiful. It's a great way to end. So thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Brewer. Let's thank our guest this afternoon.
Thank you.